He was born in 1891 and died in 1937. This is just to explain a little bit the difference between Leninism and what Gramsci was trying to achieve. Obviously, by the dates, you can see that Gramsci was alive during the Soviet Revolution, and he studied it very carefully and arrived to a number of conclusions. So we see Lenin at the front of the spike saying, in the West, where there are mass political parties and newspapers, we cannot apply the same plan as in Russia. And Gramsci on the bottom says, Lenin understood that it was necessary to move away from a war of maneuver, a triumph in 1917, to a war of positions. So that means that in Russia, they mostly move very fast. That would be a war of maneuvers to take over the state. If you remember, it was a really short process between the fall of the Tsar and the Kerensky government in March, and then in October the Bolsheviks and other leftists are already taking over power. So that's a war of maneuver, a war that moves very fast. A war of position, on the other hand, is like what we saw during the First World War, where people would try and dig in a trench and try to hold that position no matter what, and millions of people died as a result of that strategy, no? So what Lenin is saying, that in the West there are so many institutions of civil society that you need to win over before you can take over power, while on the other hand, in Russia, because it had been like a medieval country up to that point, there were not too many institutions of civil society, and they could move on very quickly and almost in a military way take over power. Bueno, so let's talk a little bit about Gramsci's life so that you have an idea who this person was. He was relatively poor, his family wasn't wealthy at all, and on top of that, the father was jailed when he was very young. But he did win a scholarship to the University of Turin in Italy, and he joined the Socialist Party in 1913. If you remember, the Socialist Party is this big, like, working class party that Lenin becomes a little, how would you say that, impatient with, because they want support the way that he thinks a revolution should be done through a small political party. So the Socialist Party ended up supporting the war, and that's the reason why we have a third international and eventually a fourth international, because the Bolsheviks and others felt betrayed by the Socialist Party approving of the war, where according to leftists, wars are always against poor people. So Gramsci had poor health and he doesn't complete his studies, but he does get to study quite a bit of history and politics, and that probably influences his vision of politics later on. So Gramsci sees that strikes that were organized in Italy in 1919 and 1920 are defeated, and he starts thinking that maybe Lenin is right and they really need a different kind of organization to take over power, a political party of people who are highly trained in socialist or communist ideas and can convince others of joining up. So he co-founds the Communist Party in 1921. Remember, the Russian Revolution was in 1917, and he becomes an undisputable leader of the party by 1924, and he's elected representative to the National Congress. However, by this point, Mussolini, the fascist that supported Hitler, is in power, and he's sent to jail. Gramsci is sent to jail in 1926, despite having immunity because he was a national representative. So in jail, his health deteriorates very rapidly. He already didn't have good health, so jail really does him in. So because his health is so bad, he's released on conditional freedom in 1934, but he dies very soon after that at the age of 46 in 1937. So jail really kills Gramsci. But at the same time that it kills him, it allows him the time and the focus that probably he didn't have when he was an active representative for the Communist Party. So it's during this time that he writes his most important books. We call it one notebook, the prison notebook, where he writes 30 of these notebooks actually, and 3,000 pages trying to understand the conditions of Italy and why and how a communist revolution would be possible there. So this turns him into one of the most prominent Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, because he elaborates on a strategy for the proletarian revolution in European countries that have a developed civil society. That means that they have institutions like Move On, or other civil society institutions that are just people getting together, citizens that want to change certain things, something that the Soviet Union didn't have. For example, in the United States, we have lots of civil society, a very, very populated civil society. We see that, for example, when we see the Women's March, we see all these organizations springing out of their communities and getting together and marching. That was something that the Soviet Union didn't have in Russia, but it was something that was very developed in European countries, and Gramsci comes up with a strategy of how to deal with revolution in a country that is not a medieval country. So he comes up with the concept of hegemony that I'll explain in a minute, which provides a better understanding of how the ruling classes can dominate or get the proletariat, the working class, to do their bidding, something that Marx wasn't quite able to explain. Marx came up with the concept of ideology that was mostly a reflection that what we saw on the realm of politics or culture, what was not the economy itself. He said that it was just a reflection of the economy, that all the ideas that we have, the laws that we have, the way of doing politics that we have, even the organization, the political organization that each country gives itself, all of this was the result of just a mere reflection of the economic conditions, which doesn't quite explain a number of things. So Gramsci is a step forward, and with his concept of hegemony, and later on we will see that Foucault comes up with the concept of discourse, which is even better than hegemony. But for now we'll study hegemony because it's a concept that was taken over in modern times by the postmodern thinkers, and it's applied in many ways, but it's different from Gramsci's concept of hegemony. So the concept of hegemony, now we can talk about it. The definition would be expansion to politics of class interest by dominant class to include other classes, cultural, moral, and ideological leadership with consent. So expansion to politics means that the bourgeois have class interest. For example, it's in the best interest of the bourgeois to pay as little taxes, corporate taxes, as possible. So one example of the fact that the bourgeois is hegemonic in the United States would be to study the way that Trump delivered the tax plan. This is a tax plan that totally benefits corporations, but somehow it's sold to the population as something that will be good for them, while in reality it's worse for us, because even though maybe I am going to pay $500 or $600 less in taxes next year, we are, as a class, as working people, we are losing tons of support that we were getting from the state, because all these corporations are paying almost no taxes now. So the big money that was coming out of the corporations through taxes is going to disappear. But somehow this, which is class interest, quite clearly this is in the interest of the 1%, somehow this is sold to me, this is given to me, this is presented to me as politics, as something that will also benefit me, the other class, not the working class. So the important part here of the second part of the sentence, cultural, moral, and ideological leadership with consent, is the consent part. We are not talking about being forced to accept this tax plan. Somehow they get me to consent to the fact that this plan is good for me too. But I'm not forced, neither by an army, nor by any kind of ideology. somehow it happens that I consent to this without domination. So this is the difference between the concept of hegemony, Gramsci style, and then the concept of hegemony that the post-structuralists use. For Gramsci, ideology, hegemony is what links the base and the superstructure. So I'll explain this, and remember also that we have the definitions of Marxism in Moodle. You can look it up and see a little more. But base is where we produce our basic needs, the economy, basically, no? The factories, even the Wall Street, all of that is a base. And the superstructure are the governments, the churches, the different ministries. The church is also part of the superstructure. The political parties, everything that it's not the economy itself, that is not the production sphere itself, and it's immaterial, and it includes lots of formatting of how the base needs to operate, right? We have all kinds of laws that protect or not labor, etc. So for him, this hegemony, hegemony of the bourgeois, it's what allows the superstructure to be connected with the base. It's what explains it. Again, in the example of the tax Trumps, the Trump taxes, we see that the ruling class is using this law in order to accumulate even more wealth. So the law that is part of the superstructure is going to affect the way that the base is going to operate. At the same time, the way that the base operates affects the law, in the sense that it's because the corporations wanted to make more money that they lobbied or they talked Trump into changing this law for their benefit. And they can do this because their thinking and their ruling is hegemonic. It's something that we all consent to, even though it's not in our best interest. They make it look as if it's in everybody's interest, but in reality, it just benefits the 1%. So he says that the ruling classes use the superstructure to coin and disseminate ideas that contribute to the manufacturing of consent, obscuring the violence and dispossession of the capitalist system. So what we see again with the example of the taxes is that the ruling classes, the 1%, as we call them, use their capacity to proliferate in the superstructure as they can, support research, they can support networks that produce media, they can produce media themselves, etc. They use all of this apparatus of the superstructure to get us to consent. And in this way, they can obscure or hide the actual violence of the capitalist system, the dispossession that always happens for working people in the capitalist system. When we consent to changing the tax code, we are unable to see that we are going to throw millions of people out of welfare, for example. We just cannot see that. It's obscured by the fact that it wasn't done in a brutal way. We were not forced to do this. There was a discussion in Congress. People had time to access media and find out about it, etc. So it looks pretty democratic, while in reality it's just a way of manufacturing consent. So contrary to what Marx thought, the superstructure, this apparatus of stuff that it's not the material base, it's not the economy, is more than just a reflection of the economic base, as it may contribute to the creation of a social reality in and of itself. If to change the example, if we think about ruling classes and hegemony and consent, why would, for example, women that are Republican and pro-life, so to speak, against abortion, to make it more clear, why would they go and impregnate themselves in these fertility clinics? They go and take the fetuses, the embryos that are frozen there, and they try to impregnate themselves because they want to make sure that embryos are not discarded. So, how does this reflect any base or economic need of the 1%? However, we see lots of movements against abortion coming from the superstructure. And at this point in time, things have changed. We no longer need millions of people in the United States to produce anything. On the contrary, we have too many people, 40 million people are poor, trying to make a living. So what Federici told us about the original accumulation of capital doesn't really apply anymore to the United States now. We don't need more bodies. We need less bodies. But somehow this idea that we needed more bodies that started in the times of original accumulation of capital, somehow that became a thing of its own. And many people nowadays believe very firmly that life is sacred and life starts at the womb. So this is an example of how the superstructure can be completely detached from the realities of the and needs of the economic base in time. Maybe long time ago, as Federici suggests, this was something very much linked to the superstructure, the idea that life begins in the womb and that we need lots of people and that life is sacred. But it's no longer the case. So it's taking a life of its own, and that shows us that there's no clear complete connection between base and superstructure, that it's something that it's that can take a life of its own, the superstructure. So another very important concept of Gramsci that we'll read over and over again in many different textbooks and studies that you will do in our classes and in other classes is the concept of civil society. I'm going to use the readings of Buttigieg, who's a Gramsci scholar, to guide me through this slide of civil society. So he says that civil society, that is that which is not government and it's not production of the economic sphere, is not really a sphere of freedom but of hegemony. It's in civil society that the hegemonic ideas of the 1% are propagated and take root in people. It's not a level field because those without economic power don't have the capacity to manufacture consent. And that's why it's so difficult for working people to change the ideas that are hegemonic in society today. He says that Gramsci's aim is to develop a revolutionary strategy, what we call a war of position in civil society, to disable the coercive apparatus of the state, thus gaining access to political power and creating the conditions that could give rise to a consensual society where no individual or group is reduced to a subaltern status. So this idea that some of us are in a space of domination within the coercive apparatus of the state or supported by the coercive apparatus of the state, that is the police, for example, is part of the coercive apparatus. All of these conditions that would give rise to a society that gives consensus is a society that produces subaltern individuals, people that don't count as much, people that are reduced to a position of depending on the 1%. So somebody who has done a lot of studies following this idea of Gramsci of the subaltern status of some of us was Gayatri Spivak when she started the Subaltern Studies Group. So this is a very important part of decolonizing strategies, the idea of recognizing who's a subaltern in society, who is a class that doesn't have power. So Gramsci realizes that in order to take on a war of position, that is a war that little by little gains a different kind of consensus in society, you need a lot of cultural preparation. That is to say, you need intellectual development, you need education on a mass scale. So you need an elaboration that is at the same time critical and theoretical, and an organization, a political party that will make sure that this is a continuing effort and with no pauses. So this is what he believes is necessary to create a counter hegemonic idea in society that will take down what the 1% wants to do. So he says the success of a social group in acquiring and maintaining stable governmental control in a modern state depends as much upon the work it carries out on civil society prior to ascending to power as on its subsequent ability to extend its influence over increasingly larger segments of civil society. So again, the war of position would mean educating and gaining consensus in lots of different spaces of civil society before you take power, something that the Bolsheviks didn't do. They already had consensus within the working class and they took over power, state power in Russia. They paid a price for that, obviously, because they didn't work on manufacturing consent in the countryside, for example. So Gramsci is very clear in this idea that you need to do a lot of previous work so that by the time you are in power, your ideas and your leadership is accepted by people. Buttigieg also says civil society is not some kind of benign or neutral zone where different elements of society operate and compete freely and on equal terms, regardless of who holds a predominance of power in government. So this means that civil society is a space of contention, of discussion, of meanings, of a manufacturing of consent, of wars over what it means to have this kind of tax cut or be able to have an abortion. This is the kind of stuff that Gramsci is thinking about. So I don't know if you can see this clearly in the slide, but this is a picture of Michelle Obama lovingly embracing George W. Bush. And I chose this picture, which is not a Photoshop. I think it's from a funeral, somebody's funeral. But since then, they've been very close friends, apparently, the Obamas and the Bushes. So Gramsci would think of this picture as the historical unity of the ruling classes. And the ruling classes, they don't necessarily have one single color. In this case, we have Michelle Obama, who was clearly part of the 1% and the ruling classes, very, very closely, intimately, we would say, embracing this Bush person that we always thought was quite different from their politics. However, if we think of it in clear ways, or at least in Gramscian ways, we could think that these are just parts of different interests of the ruling classes that don't always align. We see Trump fighting with some of the corporations here in the United States and supporting others. So the ruling classes also have conflicts. You know how the left is always fighting with each other. The ruling classes also have conflicts and they also fight, but they have the state in which they can somehow, how would you say that, soften their differences and somehow articulate policies that end up benefiting this 1% with their conflicts and everything and dispossessing us. So their historical unity is really something that can be achieved through the state, and we can think of Congress many times as a space where they dish out their differences. He also says the basic historical unity is the outcome of the organic relations between the state or political society and civil society. So in order for these relations to be organic and be good relations, the state has to work with civil society and with political society. And all of this is worked through the needs and the interests of this 1%, the ruling class. The subaltern classes, by definitions, are not unified. The working class, those who are left out of this ruling classes, are not unified, and they cannot be unified until they become a state themselves. So Gramsci thinks that it's in the struggle towards taking over the state that the working class can work out their differences. Their history, he says, is intertwined with that of civil society and is disjointed and discontinued. We, as working people, we don't really have a very clear sense of history because history is not written by working people. History is written by the ruling class. Nowadays, we see a lot more democratic stuff happening in academia, and we get to read things that favor the working class rather than the ruling classes. But this is completely new. In the times of Gramsci, for the most part, culture and academics were in the hands of very wealthy people that represented their own class. So if you think about it, how many people know the history of how America was settled? How many people know how the continent was, quote unquote, discovered by Columbus? How many people know that Columbus was a slaveholder? How many people know how many million people were killed in order for the United States to be what it is today? So this is an example of how discontinued and disjointed the history of us, the working people, is. And it's also an example of how difficult it would be for us to be able to come up with a strategy that would unify all of us, since we don't really know what happened to us and who's who. If you ask a working white person in Appalachia if he feels any connection with a Native American, they will probably say no. And if you ask them if they feel any connection with Trump, they would probably say yes. When if they knew their history, they would see that they are closer to the Native Americans because of the level of oppression they are suffering than to Trump and his class that have nothing to do with them. So another important concept of Gramsci is the idea of the organic and traditional intellectual, and this might be important for those of us who are interested in producing cultural pieces, writing books or whatever. He says that the traditional intellectual is the one that supports the hegemonic efforts of the ruling class. So people that work for the ruling classes, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, those would be traditional intellectuals that are doing the job of keeping civil society, giving consent to the ideas of the ruling classes. The organic intellectual, on the other hand, is the one that works with the Workers' Party, the one that is part of this insurrectionary slow motion movement that Gramsci sees as part of changing civil society in order to be able to access power. The problem with this organic intellectual is that many times they don't say the truth because they are working with the political aim of taking over power at some point. So while the traditional intellectual works for the 1% and the organic intellectual works for the working class, both of them at some point might be lying to us. So there are newer research and newer development in this area, and an Argentinian sociologist named Maristela Svampa came up with the concept of the amphibian intellectual, the intellectual that is part of the working class, but can also, go out of its area of comfort and be critical of this working class, something that neither the organic intellectual nor the traditional intellectual would do against their own class. So that's more or less Gramsci. I know it's very difficult to read. I hope that the presentation helps some, and we can talk a little more about this on Tuesday when we get together. But try to read it. I know it's difficult, but it's interesting, and it might help then later on when you write your papers. Bueno, thank you.